Welcome back. All right, so as the league doubles in size, I had to shrink down things a little bit, change out how I do this. We'll see how long it takes before I need the 2 foot by 4 foot board. It was close today, so we'll see how things go. But we have two divisions, and I would imagine there'd be a lot of yelling and screaming in today's world if you went with one division that's six of the established teams, and then all the expansion teams make up the other division. And that's what we see happen here. So four expansion teams are guaranteed to make the playoffs. The playoff line here is 69 points. The playoff line here is 80 points, meaning the Toronto Maple Leafs, who would have won this division, end up finishing fifth. So the way that this works, you play teams in your own division 10 times, teams outside your own division 4 times. And so, yeah, again, when people say, I see too much of that team these days, I don't know. Back in those days, you saw them a lot more. So Montreal ends up finishing first in their division and the league. Toe Blake's still the coach there. 42-22-10 record. 94 points, 236 goals scored, 167 goals against. The New York Rangers are second in the division. 39-23-12 record for 90 points, 226 goals, 183 goals against. They're coached by Emile Francis. The Boston Bruins, under the leadership of Harry Sinden, 37-27-19, 84 points, 259 goals scored, 216 goals against. Yes, Boston, who were easily last in the previous season, now they're a playoff team. Chicago finishes in the playoffs with 80 points, 32-26-16 record, 212 goals scored, 222 goals against. They're still coached by Billy Ray. Toronto misses the playoffs even though they're 2 games above 500 at 76 points. Record of 33-31-10, 209 goals scored, 176 goals against. So they finished 4 points behind Chicago despite having one more win and allowing about 50 goals less. But still, in the end, Chicago makes the playoffs, Toronto doesn't. And that's the year after they won the Stanley Cup. Detroit, 27-35-12 record. Sid Abel, the coach there. Roger Crozier at one point leaves the team. He'd come back. It's kind of a disastrous season. Even though for goal scoring, they're fine. 245 goals scored, goals against, it's an ouch. 257 goals against, they have 66 points. In the Western Division, and I say that even though some of these teams are definitely not Western teams, Philadelphia 31-32-11, record 73 points, 173 goals scored, 179 goals against. Keith Allen is their coach at this point. The LA Kings finished second in the division under coach Red Kelly. 31-33-10 record, 200 goals scored, 224 goals against, 72 points overall. St. Louis 27-31-16 for 70 points, 177 goals scored, 191 goals against. Lynn Patrick was the coach initially for this team, doesn't stick around. 4-10-2 start, they fire him and bring in Scotty Bowman, who you may know of. Bowman ends up coaching them to a record of 23-21-14, and St. Louis would go all the way to the Stanley Cup Final that year. The Minnesota North Stars, 27-32-15 record, 69 points, 191 goals scored, 226 goals against. They're coached by Ren Blair. The Pittsburgh Penguins just missed the playoffs with 67 points under coach Red Sullivan, 27-34-13 record, 195 goals scored, 216 goals against. The Seals, who will go through numerous name changes, 15-42-17 record, 153 goals scored, which is anemic compared to everybody else in the league. 219 goals against, 47 points. They're coached by Bert Olmsted. So, yeah, the Seals are going to be a discussion point for the next series of videos here as we look at their history. In fact, December 8th of 1967, the California Seals are renamed the Oakland Seals. They're not drawing fans, and there's obviously some concern right out of the gate that of the expansion teams, Oakland may be the one that's not going to make it. The season's extended to 74 games, as you may have guessed, looking at the point totals and records, up from 70 games previously. The Clarence Campbell Bowl and the Prince of Wales trophies are now awarded to the top teams in each division. Now, these are the trophies that are awarded now to the winners of their conference in the playoffs, but at that point it was for the regular season. You get awarded the Clarence Bowl or the Prince of Wales Trophy for winning your division. Prince of Wales Trophy for the East, the Clarence Bowl for the West, and that's the way it is still to this day. Alan Eagleson. Yep, we're going to start talking about Alan Eagleson here, aren't we? He is running the new NHLPA, the new rebooted, revamped NHLPA. He is also the agent for Bobby Orr. And Bobby Orr has some thoughts to this day about Alan Eagleson as his agent and the work that was done there. May 15th of 1967, a huge trade is made. So way before this season gets going, Gilles Marat, Pitt Martin, and Jack Norris are traded to Chicago by the Bruins in exchange for Phil Esposito, Ken Hodge Sr., and Fred Stanfield. Yeah, Boston wins that trade big time, and it is a huge part of the reason why Boston ends up in the playoffs the following season. You got Bobby Orr. Now you've added Phil Esposito and Ken Hodge. This team's going to win some stuff here. The Kings now have Terry Sawchuk, and he gets his 101st shutout in a 2-0 win against the Flyers. It is the 19th season in a row where Terry Sawchuk has a shutout. That's an NHL record, and pretty impressive at that. February 24th of 1968, Gary Unger starts what would be a 914-game Ironman streak. So that was the record until Doug Jarvis took that, and Jarvis had that record for a very long time before that's beaten. And then, yeah, and we'll get into the whole games played stuff as we go through the history of the league. February 24th as well of 1968. I knew back-to-back February 24th might throw me off. Rod Gilbert has a record 16 shots in a game and 4 goals. Well, it's expansion, so those expansion teams. Nope, it's a 6-1 win against Montreal. So Montreal has an off night, and Rod Gilbert has a night to remember. 16 shots, an NHL record at that point. April 6th of 1968, the Kings become the first team in NHL history to win their first 2 playoff games. They don't end up winning that series. It's against Minnesota, but they do win their first 2 playoff games, and they're the first team to ever do that. Bobby Orr starts his dominance. He wins his first of what would be 8 Norris trophies in a row. So that's pretty impressive, and it's Bobby Orr just doing Bobby Orr things. October 18th of 1967, all 12 teams play, and that's the busiest night in league history. So there were 6 games that night. That's a really busy night. Nowadays, I consider that to be a relatively quiet night. I even say, I've only got 6 games to review tonight. The hockey guy would have done well in the 60s. Of course, there wasn't an internet. Guess I could have stood on a street corner somewhere and yelled it, but anyways, the Leafs. So the Leafs are having some struggles. As you can see, they end up missing the playoffs. Part of it is, Frank Mahovlich, who struggled with mental health issues during his career, he ends up in the hospital due to a nervous breakdown. So Toronto just having their problems, not quite getting things to fall their way. And of course, they end up missing the playoffs. A year after they've won the Stanley Cup, and of course, we know their history now. This just foretells what is yet to come. Goaltending and team toughness helped the Philadelphia Flyers be the best of the expansion teams. And it's a hint of what is yet to come for the Broad Street Bullies. They're not quite there yet, but they'll get there soon enough. And they'll be the first team in this division that ends up winning a Stanley Cup. 9 of the 10 top scorers for the Pittsburgh Penguins, and both of their goaltenders are over the age of 30. So not only are the Penguins outside of the playoffs, they are an old team, completely different from now, because back then they were below 500. And objectively, they were not very good. Out of a 12-team league, they were 10th in the overall standings. So they have an old team. Philadelphia's got a tough team, and that's how things were going in Pennsylvania. January 13th of 1968, absolute horror, as for the first time since 1907, there is an injury that leads to a death on the ice. It's Bill Masterton. He takes a clean hit from 2 players. They sandwiched him, and he lands on his head on the ice. Absolutely horrific. He would pass 2 days later in a hospital, and so the Bill Masterton Trophy is born based on that tragedy for a player who is dedicated to the sport of hockey. So this is why very often goes to a player who's missed most of the season with injury or fought their way back from some really major setback, or a player who's just been in the league for a very long time and has shown that they are, in fact, really dedicated to the sport. The playoffs, when we get there, they remain 1 versus 3 and 2 versus 4. So it's not 1 versus 4, 2 versus 3. It doesn't stay that way for that long because it becomes pretty obvious as we go through their history here that there is a severe imbalance between the original 6 and the expansion 6. And so you're not going to be able to keep it with these divisions the way they are. It stays that way for a few seasons, and then the NHL wisely makes some changes. So the Hart Trophy goes to Stan Mikita, who also wins the Art Ross, and he also wins the Lady Byng. So Stan Mikita, a lot of hardware for him. The Calder Trophy goes to Derek Sanderson of the Boston Bruins, so there's another star player for them. The Norris Trophy goes to Bobby Orr of the Boston Bruins, who is going to own that trophy for a while. The Vezina goes to the combination of Rogie Vachon and Gump Worsley in Montreal. Rogie Vachon, another very good goaltender for the Montreal Canadiens, a team that's had a ridiculous amount of really good goaltenders over their illustrious history. The Conn Smythe goes to Glenn Hall of the St. Louis Blues. Glenn Hall was allowed to be picked up in expansion by Chicago because they felt he was too old. And he proves them wrong with a great performance for St. Louis. The Masterton goes to Claude Provost of the Montreal Canadiens. Your all-stars in the league, down the middle, Stan Mikita's first-line center for Chicago, Phil Esposito of Boston, second-line center. On the right side, Gordie Howe of Detroit's first team, and Rod Gilbert of the New York Rangers' second team. On the left side, Bobby Hull of Chicago is the first-team all-star. Johnny Busick of the Bruins is the second-team all-star. On the blue line, Bobby Orr of the Bruins is first team. Tim Horton of the Maple Leafs is first team as well. Your second team All-Stars, J.C. Tremblay of the Montreal Canadiens, and Jim Nielsen of the New York Rangers. In net, Gump Worsley of the Montreal Canadiens, first team All-Star, and Eddie Giacomin of the New York Rangers, second team All-Star. So a lot of the original 6 teams dominating when it comes to the trophies and showing that the majority of the best players are still here, as the points totals would tell you. And I mean, it makes sense. Since these are expansion teams, they won't have the best teams, best players right away. But it does mean there's a severe imbalance in the divisions. So Stan Mikita leads in scoring, 72 games, 40 goals, 47 assists, 87 points. Phil Esposito plays all 74 games, 35 goals, 49 assists for 84 points. Gordie Howe of Detroit, 74 games, 39 goals, 43 assists, 82 points. So absolutely methodical and reliable and consistent is Gordie Howe. Jean Rattel in New York, 74 games, 32 goals, 46 assists for 78 points. Rod Gilbert with the Rangers, 73 games, 29 goals, 48 assists, 77 points. Bobby Hull in Chicago, 71 games, 44 goals, 31 assists for 75 points. Norm Ullman in Toronto, 71 games, 35 goals, 37 assists for 72 points. Eddie Giacomin in New York leads the way in wins, 36-20-10 record, .915 save percentage. Cesar Maniago is second for Minnesota, 22-16-9 record, .912 save percentage. Maniago is very good. There are 5 goaltenders tied with 21 wins behind there, and I was worried if I wrote in all 5 goaltenders, I wouldn't have room for all the playoffs. The quarterfinals, I'm not going to go into game by game. I'll save that for semifinals, which will later be conference finals, as well as the Stanley Cup Final. Minnesota wins in 7 games over the LA Kings out west. St. Louis wins over Philadelphia in 7 games as well. So Minnesota and St. Louis upset the top 2 teams in the West. In the original 6 division, Chicago beats the New York Rangers 4-2, so that's an upset. Montreal plays Boston, which it's a bad matchup for Boston. Montreal wins 4 straight. So 6-game series for Chicago, 7-game series for Minnesota and St. Louis. Montreal just sweeping Boston aside. But Boston will get their revenge later. In the semifinals, Minnesota and St. Louis, they play the full 7 games. St. Louis wins the first game 5-3. And then I was looking for the reason why the home schedule is the way it is. Minnesota only has 2 home games in this entire series. They win at home in the second game 3-2 in overtime, and then the next 3 games are in St. Louis. Minnesota wins 5-1. St. Louis then wins 4-3 in overtime, 3-2 in the next game in overtime as well. So that's 3 games in overtime in this series. Minnesota wins 5-1, and then St. Louis, Ron Schock with a goal in double overtime. It was called the Midnight Goal. It's a 2-1 win for St. Louis, and that closes out that series 4-3 for the St. Louis Blues, where they move on to play the winner of Chicago-Montreal. And Montreal doesn't waste any time. They destroy Chicago 9-2 in the first game of the series. They win 4-1 in the second game. Then they go to Chicago. They win 4-2. Chicago wins game 4 2-1 to avoid the sweep before Montreal wins in overtime at home 4-3. And so your final score or final series is 4-1 in favor of the Montreal Canadiens. Then we get to the Stanley Cup Final, and Montreal they're not messing around. They win in overtime 3-2 in St. Louis. They win 1-0 in St. Louis in the second game. So St. Louis had the first two games at home in the series, and then Montreal goes home and they win out. They win 4-3 in overtime in game 3, and then they win 3-2 in game 4. They sweep St. Louis and win the Stanley Cup yet again, Montreal. So I went with the old sweater. I think this is dated as 1909, 1910. This is from Tricolor Sports. I don't get paid every time I mention their name. I just mention them a lot, especially during this series, because, yeah, I'm wearing Montreal a lot these days. So Bill Goldsworthy leads the playoff scoring. 14 games, 8 goals, 7 assists, 15 points. Yvonne Cornway of Montreal, 13 games, 6 goals, 8 assists, 14 points. Milan Marcetta from Minnesota North Stars, 14 games, 7 goals, 7 assists, 14 points. Dickie Moore's in St. Louis. He gets to play 18 games, 7 goals, 7 assists, 14 points. In net, Bernie Parent for Philadelphia, 963 save percentage. So that's pretty good when you lose in the first round and your goaltender still has a 963. Rogie Vachon, 930 save percentage. Gump Worsley had the exact same, both of them for Montreal, of course. Cesar Maniago in Minnesota, 918 save percentage. And Glenn Hall, your Conn Smythe Trophy winner in St. Louis, 916 save percentage. So as you can see, these videos are going to get longer because there's a lot more to talk about as the league expands. So stick around, tune in, and hey, thank you guys so much for all your support as always. Let me know your thoughts regarding this season in the comment section below. Also, as always, thank you guys so much for all your support. And if you haven't already hit like and subscribe, please do. I will talk to you again soon.